If you ignore history, you're like a man awakened in a big desert. You may die trying to exit not knowing how you got there to be directed out. 3 a.m. Voice Ministry presents another Present Truth video on the papacy persecutions, but more particularly on the number slain or persecuted, especially in the Reformation, but not there only. It appears, written with the declared intent of keeping history clear, and not allowing its intellectual demise amid many, ignorant of facts, lest they become ready to suffer for unawareness, all over again. It should be added that in the case of the Spanish Inquisition, a distinct area among the many investigatory atrocities wrought in many countries by the papacy, this has been pursued by Henry Common in particular, an historian with an early deterministic bent in his approach to history, an approach in type which has the capacity to exaggerate trends and results, and minimize actualities in a milieu of supposed or actual forces, as if the theories of man, such as this one, could possibly be true when truth does not exist, or is not available, swallowed up in deterministically conceived operations of forces relativistically churning out what is to come, themselves unaccounted for in a world unaccounted for in a philosophy that is to account for everything, without reason's aid. Constantly conforming to concepts of such kinds becomes an involved game, or series of articles, reductionist plays, prone to be bent, and can readily reek of generalizations and preconceptions, which must be verified, somehow. It certainly does not help objectivity, to have ideas operative in such all-consuming ways, resource without recourse, without the relevance of God beyond them, over them, restraining or maintaining them, as the case may be. A freer approach in which whatever is to come, is noted, whether of God or man, without prejudice, allows greater scope and far freer roving without compression. Then there are no compulsions of mind, determined to be deterministic, or if there be some change, stretching out a canvas of subjectivistically construed considerations as if reality were under one's thumb, to be accounted for by the ambit of one's mind, in the absence of other criterion. Accordingly, one criticism of Common's approach has been made, with cases in view, that he makes too much out of too limited attestations, assigning consequences from too narrow a platform. That said, however, this represents a viewpoint which in the case of Spain in one historical period, is majoring in a revision of previous historical estimates and accounts, in terms of amount, how many suffered and how. It does not of course in any factual way influence what is not in its rather narrow domain of a segment of Spanish history, in the multiply attested Romanist Inquisition in many lands, such as England, or remove the prodigies of torture and its means and cruelty concocted in the name of Jesus Christ in one of the most categorically conceivable violations of his injunction against the use of force in the propagation or defense of the faith. John 18:36, Matthew 26:22-23. This new Peter, Rome, that ignores as in Psalm 62 the no other rock insistence in the Bible, none but God, and so makes a neo-Petrine authority utterly contrary to the apostle himself, 1 Peter 5:1-3, as the bombast of another teacher, another father, as explicitly forbidden in Matthew 23:8-10, and what a father is this with such approach to many of the actual children of God? After this article, in a cited article, the place of many of the attested numerical items, numbers who suffered, is briefly considered, in the light of the cause underlying such events, as it is both wise and practical to understand such things, whether the case be earthquakes or slaughters, in seeking to avoid them. Note that at this site, ancient words and modern events ch. 14. There is also a multiplicity of further data from many sources, bearing on this topic, which the thorough student or researcher may find of value to instruct or impel thought. 1. Estimates of the number killed by the papacy in the Middle Ages. David A. Plotted. For 2 or 3 centuries, many Protestants have given figures concerning the total number of people killed directly or indirectly by the papacy during the Middle Ages. The numbers given include 50 million, 68 million, 100 million, 120 million, and 150 million. Roman Catholics typically give much smaller numbers. Frequently the figures are stated without any information about where they came from or how they were computed. The purpose of this note is to describe where some of these figures come from and to comment on their reliability. Surely nearly all Roman Catholics as well as Protestants disapprove of past religious persecutions, so this discussion should not reflect negatively on current members of the Roman Catholic Church. However, events in Nazi Germany show how easily persecution can revive, so it is necessary to be on guard against it and maintain an awareness of its history. Of course, many other groups besides the papacy have persecuted. And all of us, without Christ, have the roots of sin in ourselves. The reason the papacy stands out is that it has ruled for such a long period of time over such a large area, exercised so much power, and claimed divine prerogatives for its persecutions. The magnitude of the persecutions is important for the following reason: one can excuse a few thousand cases as exceptional, but millions and millions of victims can only be the result of a systematic policy, thereby showing the harmful results of church-state unions. In order to consider this subject, it is necessary to recall many unpleasant events. The dreadful totals, computations, and examples that follow, one after another, are not for the faint-hearted. These atrocities should convince us not so much of the evils of a particular religious system as of the depravity of the sinful human heart, and lead us to turn to Christ for repentance and salvation that we might have new hearts and be cleansed from sin. Here are some of the places where figures about religious persecutions are given. Dowling in his History of Romanism says, "From the birth of Popery in 606 to the present time, it is estimated by careful and credible historians, that more than 50 millions of the human family, have been slaughtered for the crime of heresy by popish persecutors, an average of more than 40,000 religious murders for every year of the existence of Popery." History of Romanism, pages 541, 542. New York, 1871. Commenting on this quote, a fundamental Baptist website says the following. For example, it has been estimated by careful and reputed historians of the Catholic Inquisition that 50 million people were slaughtered for the crime of heresy by Roman persecutors between the AD 606 and the middle of the 19th century. This is the number cited by John Dowling, who published the classic History of Romanism in 1847, Book 8, Chapter 1, Footnote 1. Only 7 years after its first printing, it could be said of Dowling's book, it has already obtained a circulation much more extensive than any other large volume ever published in America, upon the subject of which it treats, or perhaps in England, with the exception of Fox's Book of Martyrs. Clarke's Martyrology counts the number of Waldensian martyrs during the first half of the 13th century in France alone at 2 million. From AD 1160 to 1560 the Waldensians which dwelt in the Italian Alps were visited with 36 different fierce persecutions that spared neither age nor sex. Thomas Armitage, A History of the Baptists, Post-Apostolic Times, The Waldensians, 1890. They were almost completely destroyed as a people and most of their literary record was erased from the face of the earth. From the year 1540 to 1570 it is proved by national authentic testimony, that nearly 1 million of Protestants were publicly put to death in various countries in Europe, besides all those who were privately destroyed, and of whom no human record exists. J. P. Callender, Illustrations of Popery, 1838, p. 400. Catholic historian Virgilius admits gleefully that during the pontificate of Pope Paul IV, 1555 to 1559, the Inquisition alone, by tortures, starvation, or the fire, murdered more than 150,000 Protestants. These are only small samples of the brutality which was poured out upon dissident Christians by the Roman Catholic Church during the Inquisition. W. E. H. Lecky says that the Church of Rome has shed more innocent blood than any other institution that has ever existed among mankind, will be questioned by no Protestant who has a competent knowledge of history. The memorials, indeed, of many of her persecutions are now so scanty, that it is impossible to form a complete conception of the multitude of her victims, and it is quite certain that no power of imagination can adequately realize their sufferings. History of the Rise and Influence of the Spirit of Rationalism in Europe, Volume 2, p. 32. London, Longmans, Green, and Co., 1910. You may ask, but hey 3am Voice, how I hear little of this in history class or the news, why no outcry and public condemnation like for Hitler? Answer: because many of the news, schools etc. are either owned, influenced or being sponsored by them. But you can research and verify these claims. Don't let that smartphone be smarter than you, use it to research to be knowledgeable about these things. The following quotation is from The Glorious Reformation by S. Schmucker, D. Discourse in commemoration of the Glorious Reformation of the 16th century, delivered before the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of West Pennsylvania, by the relevant S. Schmucker, D.D., Professor of Theology in the Theological Seminary at Gettysburg. Published by Gould and Newman. 1838. Need I speak to you of the 30 Years' War in Germany, which was mainly instigated by the Jesuits, in order to deprive the Protestants of the right of free religious worship, secured to them by the Treaty of Augsburg, or of the Irish Rebellion, of the inhuman butchery of about 15 millions of Indians in South America, Mexico, and Cuba, by the Spanish Papists? In short, it is calculated by authentic historians, that Papal Rome has shed the blood of 68 millions of the human race in order to establish her unfounded claims to religious dominion, citing Dr. Brownlee's Popery an Enemy to Civil Liberty, p. 105. My friend, Revelation 13 says there will be a repeat of history. The issue will be over true worship, God's commandments, especially the true Sabbath Saturday versus climate change lockdown Sunday Sabbath that will force those who refuse this mark of the beast to have no access and a digital system to not buy or sell, and the global food and economic crisis time also referred to in Matthew 24, many will be killed then too. Why most of the advisors to the American presidents are Jesuits, why most of the supreme judges are Catholic, why almost always the CIA is headed by a Catholic and nicknamed Catholic Intelligence Agency. Estimates range up to 7 to 12 million for the number who died in the 30 Years' War. Concerning the Irish Rebellion, John Temple's True Impartial History of the Irish Rebellion of 1641, written in 1644, puts the number of victims at 300,000, but other estimates are much smaller. The figure of 68 million appeared in Schmucker's talk in 1838, in Brownlee's book of 1836, and also in a book Plea for the West by Lyman Beecher, Cincinnati, Truman, and Smith, 1835, pages 130 to 131. And let me ask again, whether the Catholic religion, in its union with the state, has proved itself so unambitious, meek, and unaspiring, so feeble, and easy to be entreated, as to justify a proud contempt of its avowed purpose and systematic movements to secure an ascendancy in this nation? It is accidental that in alliance with despotic governments, it has swayed a scepter of iron, for 10 centuries over nearly 1/3 of the population of the globe, and by a death of violence is estimated to have swept from the earth about 68 millions of its inhabitants, and holds now in darkness and bondage nearly half the civilized world? The exact quote of Brownlee referenced above is as follows. In one word, the Church of Rome has spent immense treasures and shed, in murder, the blood of 68,500,000 of the human race, to establish before the astonished and disgusted world, her fixed determination to annihilate every claim set up by the human family to liberty, and the right of unbounded freedom of conscience. Popery an Enemy to Civil Liberty, 1836, pages 104 to 105. Also, in another work Brownlee states, Papal Rome has shed the blood of 50 millions of Christians in Europe. The Roman Catholic religion viewed in the light of prophecy and history. New York, Charles K. Moore, 1843, page 60. And later in the same work. The best writers enumerate 50 millions of Christians destroyed by fire, and the sword, and the Inquisition, and 15 millions of natives of the American continent and islands, and 3 millions of Moors in Europe, and 1.5 million of Jews. Now, here are 69,500,000 of human beings, murdered by the woman of the Roman hills, who was drunk with the blood of the saints. And this horrid list does not include those of her own subjects, who fell in the Crusades in Asia, and in her wars against European Christians, and in South America. Page 97. These quotations make it clear that the figure of 50 million refers only to Christians in Europe, and does not include Christians killed elsewhere. It is also clear that Brownlee is taking these figures not from just one person, but from at least two, the best writers, and ignoring others that he feels are less qualified. Many others must have been convinced of the reputation of these individuals as well, judging from the frequency with which the figure of 50 million is quoted. Brownlee further comments on the number killed by the papacy in another work as follows. When Languedoc was invaded by these monsters, 100,000 Albigenses fell in one day. See Bryce Volume 3. 139. Page 346. There perished under Pope Julian 200,000 Christians, and by the French massacre, on a moderate calculation, in 3 months, 100,000. Of the Waldenses there perished 150,000, of the Albigenses, 150,000. There perished by the Jesuits in 30 years only 900,000. The Duke of Alva destroyed by the common hangman alone, 36,000 persons. The amount murdered by him is set down by Grotius at 100,000. There perished by the fire and tortures of the Inquisition in Spain, Italy, and France 150,000. In the Irish massacres there perished 150,000 Protestants. To sum up the whole, the Roman Catholic Church has caused the ruin and destruction of 1.5 million of Moors in Spain, nearly 2 millions of Jews in Europe. In Mexico, and South America, including the islands of Cuba and Saint Domingo, 15 millions of Indians, in 40 years, fell victims to popery. And in Europe, and the East Indies, and in America, 50 millions of Protestants, at least, have been murdered by it. Thus the Church of Rome stands before the world, the woman in scarlet, on the scarlet-colored beast. A church claiming to be Christian, drenched in the blood of 68 millions, and 500,000 human beings. W. C. Brownlee, Letters in the Roman Catholic Controversy, 1834, pages 347 to 348. Brownlee apparently revised the 69 million figure downwards to 68 million. So the figure of 68 million has several sources in the early 1800s. It appears again in a later work. Alexander Campbell, well-known religions leader of the 19th century, stated in debate with John B. Purcell, Bishop of Cincinnati, in 1837 that the records of historians and martyrologists show that it may be reasonable to estimate that from 50 to 68 millions of human beings died, suffered torture, lost their possessions, or were otherwise devoured by the Roman Catholic Church during the awful years of the Inquisition. Bishop Purcell made little effort to refute these figures. Citing a debate on the Roman Catholic religion, Christian Publishing Co., 1837, p. 327. Walter M. Montano, a former Catholic priest, asserts in his book, Behind the Purple Curtain, that it has been estimated that 50 million people died for their faith during the 1200 years of the Dark Ages. Citing Walter M. Montano, Behind the Purple Curtain, Calman Publications, 1950, page 91. And From the Shadow of Rome, by John B. Wilder, Zondervan Publishing Co., 1960, page 87. Campbell may be referring to the Martyrology of Samuel Clarke, written in 1651. Perhaps this figure of 68 million came from Brownlee or somewhere else, possibly the writings of Lorente or Clarke's Martyrology, cited above. Such figures sometimes appear in recent books, such as Wilder's, but in general, all the figures about the number killed by the papacy go back many years and have reputable sources. It is interesting that Campbell implies that the figure of 68 million includes many who were not killed, but just persecuted, while the three earlier references, including Brownlee, state that this number were killed. Campbell may have taken the earlier figure and misread it as including those who were persecuted but not killed. Here are more quotations about the number killed by the papacy. For professing faith contrary to the teachings of the Church of Rome, history records the martyrdom of more than 100 million people. 1 million Waldenses and Albigenses, Swiss and French Protestants, perished during a crusade proclaimed by Pope Innocent III in 1208. Beginning from the establishment of the Jesuits in 1540 to 1580, 900,000 were destroyed. 150,000 perished by the Inquisition in 30 years. Within the space of 38 years after the Edict of Charles V against the Protestants, 50,000 persons were hanged, beheaded, or burned alive for heresy. 18,000 more perished during the administration of the Duke of Alva in 5.5 years. Brief Bible Readings, p. 16. Let us keep a sense of proportion. The record of Christianity from the days when it first obtained the power to persecute is one of the most ghastly in history. The total number of Manichaeans, Arians, Priscillianists, Paulicians, Bogomils, Cathari, Waldensians, Albigensians, witches, Lollards, Hussites, Jews and Protestants killed because of their rebellion against Rome clearly runs to many millions, and beyond these actual executions or massacres is the enormously larger number of those who were tortured, imprisoned, or beggared. I am concerned rather with the positive historical aspect of this. In almost every century a large part of the race has endeavored to reject the Christian religion, and, if in those centuries there had been the same freedom as we enjoy, Roman Catholicism would, in spite of the universal ignorance, have shrunk long ago into a sect. The religious history of Europe has never yet been written. The Story of Religious Controversy Chapter 23 by Joseph McCabe, an atheist, who lived from 1867 to 1955. The Church, says Martin Luther, has never burned a heretic. I reply that this argument proves not the opinion, but the ignorance or impudence of Luther. Since almost infinite numbers were either burned or otherwise killed, Luther either did not know it, and was therefore ignorant, or if he was not ignorant, he is convicted of impudence and falsehood, for that heretics were often burned by the Catholic Church may be proved from many examples. Robert Bellarmine, Disputationes de Controversias, Tom. 2, Lib. 3, Cap. 22, Objections Answered, 1682 edition. Bellarmine was a Roman Catholic. Some have computed that, from the year 1518 to 1548, 15 million of Protestants have perished by the Inquisition. This may be overcharged, but certainly the number of them in these years, as well as since, is almost incredible. To these we may add innumerable martyrs, in ancient, Middle, and Late Ages, in Bohemia, Germany, Holland, France, England, Ireland, and many other parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia. From the Commentary on the Book of Revelation and Wesley's Explanatory Notes on the New Testament, 1755, in which the comments on the Book of Revelation are translated from the work of the German scholar John Bengel, and Wesley stated that he did not necessarily defend all of Bengel's statements. A final figure. Mead has calculated from good authorities that in the war with the Albigenses and Waldenses there perished of these people, in France alone, 1,000,000. Christ and Antichrist, by Samuel J. Cassels, 1846, page 257. And many similar figures could be given. Now let us consider in particular the Spanish Inquisition. Quoting Schmucker. According to Llorente, this fearful tribunal, the Inquisition, cost Spain alone 2 million of lives, and the amount of torments suffered by these, and the other victims of papal persecution, was probably greater than that of all the generations that ever lived and died in God's appointed way, by natural death. Llorente had access to the records of the Spanish Inquisition. Overall, Llorente in his A Critical History of the Inquisition of Spain, 1823, gave a much smaller figure. He calculated that more than 300,000 suffered persecution in Spain, of whom 31,912 died in the flames. Here are two passages from the Reformation in Spain, 1824, by Thomas M. Cree, p. 66, that also illustrate some of the discrepancies in such figures. In the course of the first year in which it was erected, the Inquisition of Seville, which then extended over Castile, committed 2,000 persons alive to the flames, burnt as many in effigy, and condemned 17,000 to different penances. According to a moderate computation, From the same date until 1517, the year in which Luther made his appearance, 13,000 persons were burned alive, 8,700 were burned in effigy, and 169,723 were condemned to penances, making all in all 191,423 persons condemned by the several tribunals of Spain in the course of 36 years. There is reason for thinking that this estimate falls much below the truth. According to Puig Blanch, Inquisition unmasked the number of reconciled and banished in Andalusia from 1480 to 1520 was 100,000, while 45,000 were burnt alive in the Archbishopric of Seville. Cecil Roth in History of the Marranos, page 143, cites Amadeo de los Rios as giving the figures of 28,540 burned alive, 16,520 burned in effigy, and 308,847 punished in other ways. These figures are exclusively for Jews up to 1,525, in less than half a century of existence, implying that the true figures are larger even than Llorente quoted. Speaking of Llorente's figures, Roth says, "These huge figures are open to suspicion. However, they are exceeded by the indications given by the intensely Catholic Amadeo de los Rios, usually most moderate in his views." Wilder, page 86, presents the figures in a way that can explain some of the misunderstanding about the number killed. Quoting Llorente, page 5. "The horrid conduct of this Holy Office weakened the power and diminished the population of Spain, by arresting the progress of the arts, sciences, industry, and commerce, and by compelling multitudes of families to abandon the kingdom, by instigating the expulsion of the Jews and the Moors, and by immolating on its flaming piles more than 300,000 victims." Brownlee states, "The number of victims of the Inquisition will never be known until the day of final retribution. Various have been the numbers set down. Authors of undoubted credit, says Jones, have affirmed, and without any exaggeration, that millions of persons have been ruined by this horrible court. Many were banished from Spain, 1,000,000 at a time. From 600,000 to 800,000 Jews were driven away from it at once, and all their property seized." Jones Church History 2, page 98. Then, after citing Llorente's figures, he writes, "This number fixed on by this unusually accurate historian, is far below the truth. It is generally admitted that under the first Inquisitor of Spain alone, namely, Torquemada, no less than 100,000 human beings suffered, under the above three classes, that is, they were burned, or they perished on the rack, or by it, or in exile, and perpetual confinement." Brownlee, pages 339 to 340. There is also indirect evidence of the magnitude of the victims of the Inquisition. No secrets could be withheld from the inquisitors. Hundreds of persons were often apprehended in one day, and in consequence of information resulting from their examinations under torture, thousands more were apprehended. Prisons, convents, even private houses, were crowded with victims. The cells of the Inquisition were filled and emptied again and again. Its torture chamber was a hell. Romanism and the Reformation by H. Graddon Guinness, Lectures, London, England, 1887, Lecture 4, page 101. To make the subject personal, here is the testimony of one of the victims. Before we let fall the curtain upon this awful subject, let us listen for a moment to some of the words of William Lithgow, a Scotsman, who suffered the tortures of the Inquisition in the time of James I. After telling of the diabolical treatment he received, which was very similar to that I have just described, he says, "Now mine eyes did begin to startle, my mouth to foam and froth, and my teeth to chatter like the doubling of drumsticks. Oh, strange, inhuman, monster man-manglers! And notwithstanding of my shivering lips in this fiery passion, my vehement groaning, and blood springing from my arms, my broken sinews, yea, and my depending weight on flesh-cutting cords, yet they struck me on the face with cudgels to abate and cease the thundering noise of my wrestling voice. At last, being released from these pinnacles of pain, I was handfast set on the floor with this their ceaseless imploration, Confess, confess, confess in time, or thine inevitable torments ensue. Where, finding nothing from me but still innocent, oh, I am innocent. O Jesus, the Lamb of God, have mercy on me, and strengthen me with patience to undergo this barbarous murder. Enough. Here let the curtain drop. I should sicken you were I to pursue the subject further. It is too horrible, too damnable. Romanism and the Reformation by H. Grattan Guinness, Lectures, London, England, 1887, Lecture 4 pages 103 to 104. Lower estimates for the number of victims of the Inquisition also exist, as cited by a Roman Catholic on a discussion board. The best estimate of the total number of executions under the Spanish Inquisition comes from the Encyclopaedia Judaica, not a Catholic source, which estimates the number at around 7,000. It should be remembered that the Inquisition was a court charged with hearing cases for all crimes committed on church property or against the church, clerics, or professed religious. There were several capital crimes under the Inquisition's jurisdiction besides heresy. These included murder, rape, kidnapping, assault on a bishop, and others. Might I recommend that you get Henry Common's recent book The Spanish Inquisition, A Historical Revision, N.B. Common's estimate is that there were only 3,000 executions. So there is considerable disagreement in the figures concerning the Spanish Inquisition. And such disagreements occur in the larger context, as well. The figures are rapidly decreasing with time, and our memory of past persecutions is being lost. Because records and memories are lost with the passage of time, in general the earliest records and those closest to the source are to be preferred. Another quotation helps to explain some of the discrepancies. And Walter M. Montano, writing in Christian Heritage, says, Spain has had a long history of intolerance. The number of victims sacrificed by the Inquisition in Spain almost exceeds credulity. Yet it has been shown by Llorente, who carefully examined the records of the tribunal, and whose statements are drawn from the most authoritative sources, that 105,285 victims fell under the Inquisitor General Torquemada, 51,167 under Cisneros, and 14,952 fell under Diego Perez. It is further reckoned that 31,912 were burned alive. Half that number, 15,659 suffered the punishment of the statute, and 291,450 were sent to penitentiaries. 500,000 families were destroyed by the Inquisition, and it cost Spain 2 million children! An Intolerance, Bigotry, Persecution by Lorraine Boatner D.D., taken from his book Roman Catholicism, first published 1962, Chapter 18. This quotation explains where Schmucker's figure of 2 million comes from, though it is still unclear what it means. The figure of 15,659, which perhaps should be 17,659, represents those who were killed before being burnt. Many were also expelled from Spain. This could explain the figure of 2 million. Roth in the Spanish Inquisition, page 251, discussing those who were expelled from Spain, says, the number of the exiles has been estimated variously between 300,000 and 3 million. It probably lies much nearer to the first of these figures. He also refers to the exiles as her children, possibly explaining Schmucker's statement and Montano's statement about Spain losing 2 million children. Some of the exiles had to leave their children behind to be raised as Roman Catholics, which can explain the comment about destroying 500,000 families. Commenting on Llorente's methods of calculation, Jean Dumont in his book El Egliso Riscada el Historia, Limoges, Criterion, 1985, states, Professor Gerard Dufour shows that the impressive numbers of Llorente, which are almost universally accepted, are not at all convincing. They are in no way a reasonable statistic, but only the naive imposture of purely conjectural numbers established on the basis of insupportable fragility and exaggeration. How did Llorente arrive at his figures? The answer is quite simple. Totally ignorant of the number of victims of the Inquisition, He fabricated them from conjectural accounts available to him with regard to the Tribunal of Seville during the first years of its activity, numbers provided by the early chroniclers and historians, and a lost inscription. As Mariana, one of the ancient historians, pointed out, Llorente did not take note of the fact that these numbers were only rumors. Moreover, carried away by his passions, Llorente quoted inexactly and exaggerated greatly in his editions. For, as Gerard de Fleur noted, among the 2,000 victims mentioned by Mariana were included some added up by Llorente, and the 700 mentioned by Bernaldez, the anti-Semitic chronicler, who moreover had inflated the number to satisfy the needs of his cause. Llorente did not take all these facts into account. Having thus taken entirely erroneous numbers, and these only from Seville during the early years, Llorente tranquilly multiplied them by the total number of inquisitorial tribunals and by the number of years they functioned. But as he arrived by means of this method of blind multiplication of inflated figures at a total figure that was so enormous as to be absolutely unbelievable, he reduced them on a completely arbitrary basis by 50% in general, and by 90% for the first year after each tribunal was established, because they would not have had sufficient time to pronounce sentence on anyone during the first year. Dumont is a non-Catholic professor of history at the Sorbonne in Paris and argues for very low figures. But at least from his explanation it is clear that Llorente made use not only of the records of the Inquisition but also oral accounts, which he considered as reliable. Perhaps Llorente did not believe that the written records of the Inquisition were complete. Dumont also cites unfavorably various other estimates of the number killed, including that during the term of Torquemada 100,000 were decimated by fire in 5 years, from La Grande Encyclopédie, Inventaire raison des sciences, des lettres et des arts, par une société de savants et de gens de lettres, sous la direction d'Homme. Berthelot, Hartwig d'Arenberg, etc. Paris, H. Le Mirault, 1886–1902. This echoes the figure of 100,000 from Brownlee, but with a different meaning. Another problem with interpreting such figures is that of language. Wilder's figure of 68 million apparently includes those who were not killed, but persecuted and lived. If a writer says that there were 68 million victims of the papacy, then it could be misunderstood that they were all killed. Obviously the sources from the early 1800s interpret the figure of 68 million as those who were killed. The same problem occurs with Schmucker's statement about Llorente. Schmucker says that Llorente asserted 2 million were killed in the Spanish Inquisition. Other sources claim that Llorente asserted 300,000 were killed, which was probably due to a translation or copying error as explained by Dumont. However, Llorente himself gives a smaller number that were killed, and a large number that were punished but not killed. It is not clear whether these disagreements result from a misunderstanding of the text or whether Llorente's history has been modified in some way. The latter seems unlikely because Mcree refers to Llorente's figures at a very early date. What is the basis for such a large overall estimate, whether it be 50 million, 68 million or 100 million killed? Dowling does not say where he obtained his figure. Brownlee, at least, breaks the figure into categories, but does not say where the estimate of 50 million comes from. Another source also gives some information about this topic, namely, M. D'Ale The Rationalist's Manual, 1897. Let us look for a moment at the number of victims sacrificed on the altars of the Christian Moloch. 1 million perished during the early Arian schism, 1 million during the Carthaginian struggle, 7 million during the Saracen slaughters. In Spain 5 million perished during the 8 Crusades, 2 million of Saxons and Scandinavians lost their lives in opposing the introduction of the blessings of Christianity. 1 million were destroyed in the Holy Wars against the Netherlands, Albigenses, Waldenses, and Huguenots. 30 million Mexicans and Peruvians were slaughtered ere they could be convinced of the beauties of the Christian creed. 9 million were burned for witchcraft. Total, 56 million. The source for this quote is letters from Rome by Middleton. Conyers Middleton lived from 1683 to 1750 and in 1729 wrote his letter from Rome, showing an exact conformity between popery and paganism. He was a rationalistic theologian, and denied the occurrence of miracles in the Church. Of course, Protestants as well as Catholics have implemented witch hunts. But perhaps Middleton was the source of some of these figures of millions killed by the papacy. Because he was not an Orthodox Christian, some Protestant writers may have been reluctant to cite him. From the information given, it is possible to give a plausible explanation for the origin of some of the common figures. Bengal's figure of 15 million seems to be general knowledge, passed down from the time of the persecutions themselves, and obtained by some method of computation. Perhaps the same people who computed this figure also computed the figure of 50 million, or perhaps someone extrapolated from this figure to the 50 million figure for the entire history of the papacy. Brownlee shows how the figures of 68 and 69 million derive from the 50 million figure. Middleton's figure of 56 million does not include the figure of 50 million Protestants, except for an overlap of 3 million. Adding these to Middleton's figure gives a result of about 100 million. The figures of 120 and 150 million for the number killed by the papacy in the Middle Ages are still unexplained. Voltaire apparently estimated that 20 million witches were killed. Perhaps using this estimate and the casualties for the 30 Years' War explains some of the higher figures. It is noteworthy that these figures of millions killed by the papacy do not derive solely from 19th-century scholarship, as is sometimes claimed, but also go back to sources in the 18th and even 17th century. Clarke. If Clarke cited 2 million killed of the Waldenses alone, surely he would have reckoned the total killed by the papacy at many millions. The question remains whether these figures about the magnitude of religious persecution are trustworthy. Even though the figure of 56 million is broken into categories by Middleton, it is unclear where the individual figures come from and how reliable they are. It is possible, at least, to give a partial answer to this question. Middleton gives a figure of 1 million killed among the Waldenses, Albigenses, and others. Mead, cited in Cassels, gives a figure at least as large. Clarke doubles the figure. For this figure, at least, Dr. Middleton had some basis, and did not invent it out of thin air. The same is true of the figure of 9 million witches killed. Gottfried Christian Voigt, 1740–1791, extrapolated from his section of Germany to calculate 9,442,994 witches killed throughout Europe. From this came the common estimate of 9 million. Selected death tolls for wars, massacres and atrocities before the 20th century, by Matthew White. Therefore the figure of 9 million witches killed also has a source and was not made up. From these two examples it is possible to infer Middleton's approach. All of the figures he gave were obtained from another source. None of the figures were increased, in fact some of them may even have been reduced. Even the figure of 30 million Mexicans and Peruvians killed, for which we do not have a source, is not too far off from the estimate of 15 million given by Schmucker, cited above. However, it would be useful to look at one of these figures in more detail, to see how reliable it is. This can help to give insight into the reliability of the entire estimate. It is possible to reconstruct how Voigt arrived at his figure. This is from a German publication, Septep, from July, 2001. Quoting Voigt, the publication is highly critical of Voigt's estimate, calling it statisfiction. Nonetheless, from the surrounding text, also in German, one can infer Voigt's method of computation. In a 30-year period he found records of 30 cases of witches being condemned. He estimates the actual number to be at least twice as high, but for the sake of an estimate supposes that 40 witches were burnt during this 30-year period. At this rate, in a century there would be 130 times 40 or 133 witches burned, and in the period from 1100 to 1600, 5 centuries, there would be 665 witches burned, approximately. He then notes that the population of this part of Germany is about 1/15,000 of the population of Europe, actually slightly more. So multiplying 665 by 15,000 one obtains an estimate of somewhat less than 10 million witches executed in Europe in 500 years. The population of Europe was about 50 million, so Voigt's area of Germany would have had somewhat over 4,000 people. 1 or 2 executions of heretics a year would have only been a tiny fraction of the population, but no less serious thereby. This number is conceivable, in a sense. If 2% of the population were witches, and half of them were caught at some time during their life and executed at an average age of 40, then 1/40 of 1% of the population would be executed as witches each year, which is 1 person per year in a population of 4,000. Now, the number of witches executed may have varied from time to time and from place to place, so the above estimate is not necessarily correct. However, Voigt felt that his area of Germany was representative of Europe as a whole for this 500-year period. Modern rebuttals to his figures mention that not many records exist of witches being executed. But this ignores the fact that records are often lost or destroyed. Even Voigt realizes this in his discussion. Some executions may never have even been recorded. Also, the fact that so many of Middleton's sources gave numbers in the millions adds credibility to Middleton's overall figures. Concerning witches, it is interesting that many of those debating the 9 million figure have no idea where it came from, and those ridiculing the figure act as though it were invented out of thin air. Some say that these high death toll figures are tinged by anti-Catholicism. One could just as well say that arguments against these figures are tinged by pro-Catholicism. The figures are so large that even Protestants probably found them hard to believe and preferred smaller rather than larger figures. Wesley or Bengel, at least, did not find the figure of 15 million killed in 30 years to be ridiculous, though he admitted it might be somewhat too large. Many other well-regarded authors also found these figures to be reasonable, as cited earlier. Of course there are also instances of cruelty of Protestants toward Catholics that could be mentioned. And Protestants as well as Catholics have mistreated Indians. There is also a plausible source for Middleton's estimate of 30 million killed in the New World. In 1542 Bartolome de las Casas wrote Brevissima Relation, a short description of the atrocities committed by the Spanish on Native Americans in America. In it he states, "I affirm it as very certain and approved that during these 40 years, 1502 to 1542, owing to the aforesaid tyrannies and infernal works of the Christians more than 12 million souls, men, women and children, have perished unjustly and tyrannically, and in truth I believe I should not be overstepping the mark in saying 15 million. 2 ways have in general been used by those who come to the Indies calling themselves Christians to extirpate and root out these wretched people utterly from the land. 1. By unjust, cruel, bloody and tyrannical wars, the other, after they have killed off all those who could long or sigh for liberty, that is to say, all chiefs and warriors, they oppress those that remain, being commonly only children and women, with the most horrible and relentless and pitiless slavery to whichever men or beasts were put." In a version of this work translated in 1699, the title reads an account of the first voyages and discoveries made by the Spaniards in America, containing the most exact relation hitherto published of their unparalleled cruelties on the Indians, in the destruction of above 40 millions of people, with the propositions offered to the King of Spain to prevent the further ruin of the West Indies. Las Casas spent the last 40 years of his life trying to improve the conditions of the native inhabitants in the lands under Spanish control. Many historians believe that the population of Mexico and South America decreased by 20 to 30 million during the Spanish conquest. Later accounts assigned more of a role in this population decrease to the introduction of diseases, such as smallpox, to which the Indians did not have immunity, than to the cruelty of the Spaniards. However, even the Black Plague, which has a higher mortality rate than smallpox, is estimated to have killed only a fourth of Europe's population, so it seems unlikely that most of these Indians were killed by disease. In severe smallpox epidemics, 30 of every 100 attacked may die, and not everyone will even be exposed. In 1944 historian Romulo Carbia linked Las Casas' work to the Black Legend, which portrays the Spanish as cruel and bigoted. Carbia felt that Las Casas had exaggerated the brutality of the Spanish. But at least Middleton's figure of 30 million has a reasonable source. However, there is still a question about whether the papacy was responsible for these deaths. Another issue is that this figure does not even include those who died after the Spanish conquest, either by Inquisition or mistreatment or wars instigated by the papacy. Concerning Middleton's estimate of 5 million killed in Spain during the 8 Crusades, the Crusades took place from 1095 to 1272 to recapture the Holy Land, and during this time there were also persecutions in Europe. Therefore Middleton's figures do not even include those killed during the later Inquisition. Wesley or Bengal accepted a figure of about 15 million or more killed from 1518 to 1548 for this, and many more killed later, which other authors may have added to Middleton's total figure. Spain had been conquered by the Muslims, and the reconquest by papal countries took many centuries. The Crusades were not only directed against the Holy Land but also towards the reconquest of Spain, which the papacy strongly promoted. This explains the meaning of Middleton's figure for 5 million killed in Spain during the Crusades. As for the Crusades themselves, H. Walschlager, Die Bewaffneten Wallfahrten in Jerusalem, Zurich 1973, estimates that there were probably 20 million victims in the Holy Land and Arab, Turkish areas alone, with all figures taken from contemporary Christian chroniclers. This book includes a full list of original medieval Christian chroniclers' writings. Of course, other estimates for the Crusades are smaller, but such original sources deserve a high weighting. Walschlager also estimates that 1 million Albigenses were killed, exceeding Middleton's figure because the latter also includes other groups. Concerning the Crusades, Brownie states, "The last, in the Holy Land, commenced in the year 1096, and it raged with fury, for 2 centuries, causing, according to Mons. Voltaire, the death of 2 millions of men, in the flower of their youth, and ill-prepared, we fear, to meet their judge." Brownlee, page 341. Let us consider the estimate of 9 million witches killed, in another way. Our main concern is not with the number of witches killed, but with the total number executed by the papacy. It is reasonable to assume that the total number executed by the Church was much larger than the number of witches, probably by a factor of at least 2 or 3, at least. We read much more about Bible-believing Christians being executed than about witches. If Voigt felt that 40, or even 60, witches executed per 30 years was a reasonable rate, he probably would have felt that 80 total executions by the Church of witches and others per 30 years was reasonable, as well. This, extrapolated to Europe for 500 years, yields 18 million executions. Extending the argument to other regions dominated by the papacy, especially Central and South America and India, may at least double the figure to 36 million, and then extending the figures to the full 1260-year reign of the papacy or adding in the 15 million mentioned by Wesley or Bengal would undoubtedly bring the total over 50 million. This gives added support to the oft-quoted estimate of 50 million. This does not even include those executed in special circumstances such as crusades and wars, and does not include those who died in prison due to illness or maltreatment or suicide. Voigt's area of Germany must have had a prison, so it is reasonable to assume that there were the equivalent of nearly 15,000 prisons in all in Europe. If each year, 4 people died in each prison due to illness or mistreatment or suicide, then there would be 60,000 deaths per year. And extended to 1,000 years this gives 60 million deaths, but not all the responsibility of the papacy. Though we will never know the exact number this side of eternity, it is reasonable to conclude that the estimate of 50 million is in reality many times too small. Lyman Beecher stated that the papacy has swayed a scepter of iron, for 10 centuries over nearly 1/3 of the population of the globe. Currently about 1/3 of the world population professes Christianity. The world population is estimated to have grown from 200 million in 600 AD to 545 million in 1600 AD. 1/3 of this population would have grown from about 70 million to about 200 million in this time, with a reasonable average of about 100 million. Voigt felt that 2 witches executed per year for a population of about 4,000 was a reasonable number, even in an area that had been Christian for hundreds of years. This amounts to 1/20% executed per year. Assuming this proportion of executions of all heretics, Not just witches, for 1,000 years for an average population of 100 million ruled by Rome, gives about 50,000 executions a year or a total of 50 million deaths. Whenever Rome encountered other religions as the papacy extended its domain, the death toll was higher, so it is reasonable to assume that the average number killed was larger than this. This does not even include those killed during crusades and wars instigated by the papacy. It is also a steady-state figure and would not include those killed during intense periods of the Inquisition. Part 2 is coming soon. If you ignore history, you're like a man awakened in a big